Canadian Bulldog from Wrestling Merchandise and Memories. That's merchandiseandmemories.com. And today we're talking about 15 wrestling magazines that you totally forgot about. Just before we get started, wanted to let you know that Wrestling Merchandise and Memories has more than 100 unique and conversation-starting top 50 lists on its site. Check it out at bit.ly/top 50 lists. Wrestling magazines were a huge part of fan culture in between the 1980s and 1990s. Many local newsstands, supermarkets, and convenience stores had a plethora of magazines on their shelves to keep up with the insatiable demand of wrestling fans. You have to remember, this was largely before the internet or expanded cable television, so to find out about different promotions, wrestling magazines were the source to find out information. Now, many of us remember the staples of this industry: Pro Wrestling Illustrated, WWF Magazine, Inside Wrestling, even WCW had its own magazine for several years. But what follows is a list of wrestling magazines that you may not be quite as familiar with. Wrestling All-Stars, Heroes and Villains was a newsstand staple that packed a lot of photos and controversial headlines on its cover. Published by industry veteran George Napolitano, Heroes and Villains gave equal ink to all of the major promotions of the day and featured several full-color pinups. Glow magazine was the official publication of the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling promotion. It hit newsstands in 1988 and lasted roughly a year. The magazine was a tongue-in-cheek look at many of the Glow characters, including Hollywood, Mount Fiji, Aunt Kitty, and Colonel Ninotchka. Victory Sports Wrestling had a lengthy run on the newsstands running from 1972 to 1989. Run by London Publishing, the same shop that published PWI, Inside Wrestling, Wrestling Superstars, and so many other titles we've mentioned here, this one didn't seem to have as much focus as some of the other so-called aftermags. Wrestling Fury was published from 1987 to 1993 and featured tons of full-color articles covering most of the North American promotions. In addition to ranking the sexiness of both male and female wrestling stars, Wrestling Fury also published some of the goriest, bloodiest photos from that era. Wrestling Review goes all the way back to the 1950s and was published all the way up until the mid-1980s. Most of the articles were relatively short and told tall tales from all around the world of professional wrestling, and this one also included its fair share of blood and guts. Wrestling's Main Event was published from 1982 to 1994. It featured a combination of black and white and color photos, a multi-page Wrestling's Roundup section that discussed what was happening in the territories, and controversial headlines such as, "Why Don Morocco Should Leave the WWF Now?" WWE has had a few lesser-remembered magazine titles, such as WWE Kids. This was at the height of WWE's PG era and was published from 2008 to 2015. Here, there was no cursing, no blood, and barely any violence. Instead, you were encouraged to draw pictures of John Cena, read short stories about The Undertaker, and even design a mask for Rey Mysterio. Wrestling 86, or depending on which year it was published, Wrestling Name of Year, began publishing in 1983 and was a quarterly publication that wrote long-form articles doing deep dives on the state of the business. It ceased being printed in 1992, paving the way for Wrestling 93 Rule Breaker. This was the first magazine of its kind to side exclusively with heels, driven by the king of that writing genre, Eddie Elner. It also featured the editorial debut of Joey Styles. Rule Breaker morphed into the monthly Wrestling Bad Guys magazine, which ran until 1996. NWA Wrestling Wrap-Up was the predecessor to WCW Magazine. Published in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this full-color publication had short-form articles and had the look and feel of the program you might receive at live events. And in fact, it was the program that NWA/WCW was selling at its live events. ECW Magazine was, of course, the official publication of Extreme Championship Wrestling, produced during the end of ECW's run between 1999 and 2000. Articles in the magazine blurred the lines between storyline and real life, chronicling the adventures of ECW stars such as Raven, Sabu, Taz, and the Dudley Boys. Some fans may remember World of Wrestling, or WWW Magazine, during the Attitude Era, which consistently broke kayfabe and wrote exclusively for the internet wrestling community. But do you remember its spin-off, WWW Extra? This publication hit newsstands every 2 weeks with some of the most current material for a magazine at the time. Unfortunately, WWW Extra was short-lived. New Wave Wrestling lasted a long time on the newsstands, considering it looked like it was created on Broderbund print shop software from the 1980s. Largely black and white and having a tabloid feel to it, New Wave lasted from 1992 to 2006 and included its own rankings plus games and puzzles for the fans. One more London publishing title was Wrestling Classics, which lasted for a couple of years in the early 1990s, seemingly fronted by Captain Lou Albano. Each magazine had a theme to it, using previously published materials from different Apter magazines from years gone by. They also included a Future Classics article in which each issue talked about a current story. And finally, we've all heard of WWF or WWE Magazine. You've probably even heard of the more adult-oriented Raw Magazine. But in 2004, WWE Magazine briefly turned into SmackDown Magazine so that each competing brand would have their own publication. SmackDown lasted about 2 years before it went back to the WWE Magazine format. How many of these wrestling magazines did you remember? Any really obscure publications we forgot? Leave us a comment, and please make sure to like and subscribe to the Wrestling Merchandise and Memories YouTube channel.